Okay, so now we're beginning our study of the gospel for the fifth Sunday of year B. So has anyone prepared to read the gospel? In the future, even if you're not a deacon, if you're a good lector, we do let lectors like during Holy Week, when we have solemn reading of the Passion, often we have lay people doing part of the gospel. So I think that would be appropriate for this class if any of the lectors want to practice on some gospel passages. So you'll be jotting down any words or phrases that strike. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. On leaving the synagogue, Jesus entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Simon's mother-in-law lay sick with a fever. They immediately told him about her. He approached, grasped her hand, and helped her up. Then the fever left her, and she waited on them. When it was evening, after sunset, they brought to him all who were ill or possessed by demons. The whole town was gathered at the door. He cured many who were sick with various diseases, and he drove out many demons, not permitting them to speak because they knew him. Rising very early before dawn, he left and went off to a deserted place where he prayed. Simon and those who were with him pursued him, and on finding him said, "Everyone is looking for you." He told them, "Let us go on to the nearby villages that I may preach there also. For this purpose have I come." So he went to their synagogues, preaching and driving out demons throughout the whole of Galilee. The gospel of the Lord. So not questions at this time, words or phrases that struck you.
Everybody is looking for you.
I was going to say, this is one I remember so well because I've always smiled if I'm out in the congregation. Then the fever left her and she waited on them. I've always smiled at that. And I'm going, well, you can guess he was hungry or something. He needed somebody to get up and fix him some food.
Okay, but remember, at this point, we just focus on the phrases. No need to explain. Any other words or phrases that struck people?
Driving out demons.
Driving out demons. Okay.
Not permitting them to speak because they knew him.
Okay.
Went off to a deserted place where he prayed.
Deserted place where he prayed. Okay, I'll go ahead now and give a little background. So first, some general liturgical context. We are in year B. In year A, we read mainly from Matthew, In year B, we're reading from Mark, and next year in year C, we read mainly from Luke. We read from John every year during Easter time. Since Mark is the shortest gospel, we also supplement Mark with readings from John. And this summer, we'll read chapter 6 of John, the Bread of Life Discourse. We begin our year, our Catholic Happy New Year, is the first Sunday of Advent, either toward the end of November or beginning of December. The first passages we read from Mark were from chapter 13 about the second Advent, the second coming of Christ. Unlike Matthew and Luke, Mark has no infancy narrative, no story about the birth of Jesus. Like John, Mark begins the story of Jesus with the relationship of the adult Jesus to the adult John the Baptist. Our proximate liturgical context, on the baptism of the Lord, we read about the baptism of Jesus. Second Sunday of Ordinary Time, we read a passage from John, a short supplementing of Mark, John's testimony to Jesus, the first disciples as John tells their story. The third Sunday, we have Mark again, all in chapter 1, Jesus preaching and calling the first disciples. Then the fourth Sunday, continuing, Jesus preaches and exorcises a demon in the Capernaum synagogue. Then on this Sunday, we actually have three stories. First is what we call a healing story, where Simon's mother-in-law is healed. And then we get what's called a summary. A healing story tells the details. Well, she was sick, she had a fever, he laid his hand on her, and so on. Whereas a summary said, oh, the people had all kinds of illnesses and he cured them all. Or an exorcism story is the demon cried out and said, what do you have to do with us, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? And Jesus said, be quiet. That's an exorcism story. Whereas a summary is, and there were lots of demonized people and Jesus cast all the demons out. So we have a summary, and then after praying, Jesus departs to preach elsewhere. So different styles of literature in this one passage that we're reading. A little bit of background. Mark is written approximately the year 70 AD, give or take 2 or 3 years. It's the first gospel to be written. It was used as the main source by Matthew and Luke. They add to Mark, but they preserve his structure of a Galilean ministry, a journey to Jerusalem where Jesus dies and then rises from the dead. According to ancient tradition, it was written in Rome, and in ancient times, there was no other city that said, hey, that's a mistake. It was written here. And modern scholars think it might have been written in Syria or Galilee or some other place, but I'm still in the Rome camp on that one. By tradition, it was written under Peter's influence. In later patristic tradition, it's practically like he's there writing down Peter's sermons, and then Peter proofreads the gospel and signs off on it. I don't think it was anything like that. It's just the early church's desire to attach gospels to different preachers. We know for a fact that Peter was in Rome, and I think it would have been impossible to write a gospel in Rome without in some way being influenced by Peter's preaching. So even if Mark was never in church at the same time as Peter was at the same church, he could very well have written under some of Peter's influence. Let's see, verse 29, leaving the synagogue. In Mark's context, this whole story happens on the Sabbath, which was mentioned back in verse 21. which was in the synagogue in Capernaum. So this picks up where last Sunday left off. So it's the Sabbath in the synagogue. And then we have the cure of Simon's mother-in-law. We don't know her name. Like most women in the Gospels, she is anonymous. We never learn her name. If we only had Mark, we might wonder if Simon Peter were a widower. However, Paul helps us out. In same chapter we read from Paul, but an earlier part of chapter 9 in 1 Corinthians, talking about his rights as an apostle. Do we not have the right to be accompanied by a wife, as the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Cephas is the Aramaic word for Peter. That's Cephas, it would be in Aramaic, or Kepha. Anyway, so we know that Simon Peter was married even after Jesus died and rose from the dead, but his wife is never mentioned in any story, in any gospel. The wife of the most important of Jesus's apostles is not even mentioned in any gospel story, only Peter's mother-in-law. And this is a reminder of the very fragmentary nature of our information about the early Jesus movement. Often we think we have a very clear idea of what the early Jesus movement was like, and it's our obligation as a church not to change anything. Actually, that's a very mistaken assumption.
Sister John.
What the tradition that we have is very fragmentary and select. Some comment,
Thank you, Mary.
he was waiting on them. The Greek word is diakone. She was serving them. And this is related to diakonos, which is the word for deacon. There were women deacons in the early church. Paul, writing to the Romans in the 50s, mentions the deacon, diakonos, Phoebe in chapter 16, verse 1. And so 15 years before the Gospel of Mark is written, we know that there are women deacons in the church, and many of Mark's readers would have seen the role of these women servants, these women deacons, seen their role foreshadowed in the story of Simon's mother-in-law. By the way, that might be the reason that in the Catholic Church that we didn't read that section of 1 Corinthians on Sunday, where Peter said, where Paul says, "Don't I have the right to have a wife like all the other apostles, including Peter?" Okay, enough of that. After sunset in verse 32, the Sabbath is now over. So once the sun goes down, and technically the sun goes down and you can see 3 stars without moving your head. That's the modern rule of when Saturday is over and Sunday begins. The people are now free to carry their sick around. The Sabbath is over, so they bring all kinds of sick people and possessed people to Jesus. Those possessed by demons. In the ancient world, sickness, typo there, I forgot to finish. Sickness was often ascribed to demons. And my question is, does one have to believe in ancient medicine to be a true Christian? I don't think so. If my doctor tells me that my cough is because I have a demon, I'm going to go get a second opinion and maybe a second doctor. People also used to believe that the reason that the planets moved among the stars was that spirits moved them. We don't need to believe believe that anymore. We don't need to believe ancient astronomy. We don't need to believe ancient medicine. But then the question is, what is the modern equivalent? And I think what the ancient world, they tended to conceptualize things. We tend to think of these realities, and they are realities, as abstract movements. So we can talk about like capitalism or communism or racism or materialism. These forces in our society that have more control over us than we realize, or sometimes we rely on the insights of medicine and psychology, and we'll talk about people who are paranoid or guilt-ridden. There's some power that's keeping them from being the best person that they can be. This is a reality. We know people who aren't the people that God is calling them to be. We know that sometimes it might be some kind of weakness. We know that there are forces in our society, and what the modern preacher has to do is to preach to today's congregation so that they feel the same liberation from contemporary forces as ancient people felt when they heard that Jesus was able to cast out demons, that Jesus was able to heal disease. So that's the modern equivalent. He did not allow the demons to speak, for they knew him. That's what scholars call, some say, the Messiah, the messianic secret. It's going to be a theme all through Mark. John Meyer says a better wording is Son of God secret. The first sentence in Mark is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. From the beginning, the reader knows that Jesus is the Son of God. Now, the reader doesn't know what that means for Mark, but he knows that Jesus is Son of God. And by reading the story, we'll find out what it means for Mark. It does not mean miraculously conceived, for instance. Mark has no infancy story. But Son of God, and these demons proclaim it, and Jesus always silences them. And the best theory that I have found is that the first human being to call Jesus Son of God in Mark's gospel is the centurion. After Jesus dies on the cross, the centurion says, truly, this man was the Son of God. As Mark tells the story of Jesus, no human being can possibly understand what being Son of God means unless it also means dying on the cross. And then in verse 35, Jesus prays. Mark, it's one of Luke's favorite themes. Mark doesn't hammer it home quite so much, but he does portray Jesus as the subject of the Greek verb for to pray 5 times. He portrays him praying in chapter 6, right after the feeding of the 5,000 and before the story of Jesus walking on the sea. Jesus is separated from his disciples praying. And then Jesus prays 3 times in Gethsemane, as Mark tells the story of the night after the Last Supper. So those are my main points. Let's see, what do we do? So echo the tradition. Okay, so questions or comments or observations?
Father Pat,
Yes.
what you just said sort of answered a question I've had for a long time, and that is, why were there so many demonic possessions around the time of Christ? And if a lot of that was simply curing a disease that we now know how to treat, then that makes sense. But if you look at verse 34, he says that he cured many who were sick with various diseases,
Uh-huh,
and he drove out demons.
uh-huh.
It's like it's a totally different thing. And I'm wondering why the great frequency of demonic possession back then.
Okay, actually, they didn't believe that all sickness was caused by demons, but they believed that some of it was. Now, so I guess there's two ways of looking at this. Like by the way, in the Old Testament, everything comes from God. So Saul, today we would say that Saul was clinically depressed. And they said, well, there's this good harp player, David, we're going to let him play the lyre, and that'll cheer you up. So that's one story of how David gets introduced to Saul. But if you read the story closely, it says Saul was oppressed by an evil spirit sent by Yahweh. And when David would play the lyre, the evil spirit from the Lord, from Yahweh, would leave. So at that time, they thought all things, things like this, could be from evil spirits. But notice that God, everything good and everything bad, everything in the Israelite mind comes from God. By the New Testament time, the demons no longer work for God. They work for the head demon, Satan, or the devil. And so you can have, and there are parts of the world today where a lot of sickness is ascribed to demons. And our modern scientific outlook has changed the way that we view things. Like, we still say somebody had a stroke, but today we think of a blood clot, in the wrong place. When we hear they had a stroke, we don't ask who struck them. Well, in Shakespeare's time, it was obvious who struck them. God had struck them, or maybe some devil. But God, that's why we call it a stroke. And Benjamin Franklin, when he invented the lightning rod, he was considered to be wicked, because in stories in the Bible, some wicked people get struck by lightning. And if God wants to strike people with lightning, Benjamin Franklin, who are you to invent a way to protect these people from God's righteous anger with them? So the point is, we have to realize that our view of the world is different from the ancient view of the world, and that many things that they would ascribe to a personal demonic force, we say, well, it's a blood clot. Now, or we say it's epilepsy is some kind of bad chemical imbalance in your brain, and if you take this medicine, you'll have fewer attacks. Now, you could make the argument, well, just like God can work through nature, so can demons. So demons can cause blood clots, and the fact that it's a blood clot doesn't mean that it wasn't God who struck them, or a demon who caused that stroke. So I'm not saying that one way is right and the other way is always absolutely wrong, but I'm saying that the ancients looked at it very different from the way that we do. And I don't think it's the preacher's job to insist either on ancient cosmology or on a flat earth or on the details of ancient medicine. Uh, that was my main point. But and when you say, why were there so many? I think if those people were in our world today, they would find just as many demon-possessed people as were back then. It's not that there are any less people. The reality of human suffering, which Job gives us, the reality of human suffering is there. And there are multiple explanations for it. When I'm a hospital chaplain, my job is to understand the patient's perspective and not to explain to them, if they think it's a demon, I'll pray to God to help God, to help release them from this, the power of this evil, from the power of this demon. I enter their world like Paul. I try to be all things to all people. Now is not the time for a lesson in theology while they're critically ill in the hospital, and I explain to them differences of worldview. So those are the thoughts that your excellent question raises in my pastoral mind. Thank you. Somebody else was going to jump in.
Oh, Father,
Yes.
on this subject of demons, and I guess you could actually to me, demons represent psychological issues in people.
Uh-huh.
They can't deal with life, and it may show itself in a physical capacity. Years ago, when I worked at Schaumburg, there was a young woman that came in there, and her arm kept turning blue. And they, from lack of circulation, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong. We'll come to find out after they worked with it, she had a family issue, and it was a psychological thing. She was doing that to herself as, I guess, a way of getting attention or something like that. And it was not a physical issue. She could mentally do that. So to me, a lot of what we would call demons today are the people that have psychological issues in one way or another, and they have to be cast out.
Uh-huh. And so we look at it very different. When I was studying clinical pastoral education, one thing I learned is you need to know a little bit about the patient's religious background. Like, if someone is Catholic or High Church Episcopal and they say they're hearing voices, they might be schizophrenic. But if this is a Pentecostal, saying that Jesus told them to do something, they're probably not schizophrenic. That's the way that they talk in their religious tradition. So it's not that the experience is necessarily different, but the way that people describe their experience depends a lot on their religious background. And what's pathological for one religious group would not be pathological for someone speaking from a different background. And I appreciate your background in the psychology part, but the other thing is, I'm troubled that we have, without taking sides, I try to be politically neutral, even though I have strong opinions, but there are tens of millions of Americans that believe we have a properly elected president, and tens of millions who don't believe that it was a legitimate election. And in New Testament times, Paul, I think in Ephesians or one of the Pauline letters, it talks about the spirits of the air. It's like these isms that are in the air that influence millions of people, that enslave millions of people. And the gospel message is that that faith in Jesus Christ can liberate from this enslavement. But the other thing is that the Christian message also includes the cross. And there's what Dietrich Bonhoeffer, God rest him and reward him, would call cheap grace. That Christians who want to be real Christians but aren't ready to do the suffering that real Christianity requires. And to me, it's a lack of our faith in the victory of Christ that enslaves us to these opinions, for what that's worth. So I tend to think in terms of the sociology of it all, but I think a good balance between sociology and psychology gets us back to the experiences the New Testament people are talking about. Yeah. Goodness, well, we've had fun. Before we stop, I'll go ahead and read it. I read it from the New American. We'll read from the New RSV, and then we'll call it a day. And if anyone wants to stay and chat, we can. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. As soon as Jesus and his disciples left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told Jesus about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. By the way, that's the same word used for resurrection from the dead. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sunset, they brought to Jesus all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, Jesus got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." He answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do." And Jesus went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. The gospel of the Lord. Okay, so we'll end on that.